Hi, my name is Rosemary Martin. I am a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and this is my final presentation on my final paper for Anthropology 242 Native Cultures of Alaska. My paper was titled Transformational Storytelling, the intersection of Indigenous and Western ideologies to implement change. And part of the reason I wanted to write this paper was because my own experience, I have learned to navigate difficult conversations where stereotypes and expectations have been presented to both my Indigenous and Black lineage. And in a way, storytelling has helped me make those connections between value systems and ways of knowing and ways of living. And I wanted to build on that same concept in this perspective as we have studied research papers and combined both my lived experience and the research that we have done throughout this semester, and really just talk about transformational storytelling. So I started off my paper talking about what storytelling is. In an Indigenous perspective, storytelling sustains the sacred relationships between Indigenous peoples, their land, and their community. It looks like oral history, and it can also look like practicing traditional activities like preparation of food, arts and crafts, and other traditions. Oh, and dancing. And then I also talked about Western storytelling and how it documents stories and ways of living through data and artifact collection. This looks like research, photography, videography, as well as papers. And so as I talked about storytelling, I also shared some research, like for example, by Clifford, that talks about how storytelling practices in the Western context haven't always benefited everyone involved. And in some cases, stereotypes were created by sharing how anthropologists were seen as negative, intrusive, and arrogant in their approach, and how there had become an entangled relationship between Western and Indigenous communities, but also shared about how this entanglement, as Clifford describes, can be undone and revisited through efforts that considers both perspectives in the process of storytelling, and how when that is done, there is mutual respect, and it can also help both sides of the Indigenous and the Western perspective begin to recognize the integrity of each other's knowledge systems and ways of living. So essentially, I talked about how partnering the two perspectives, both sides can grow together in learning how they can navigate the world or their world and incorporate storytelling practices that honor, respect, and build the community. Then I went into talking about transformational storytelling, which I shared was a blending of Western and Indigenous methods and how it can create space for communities to be empowered in their efforts towards preserving, revitalizing, and creating a sustainable culture. Dementi-Leonard's research talks about how storytelling can create space for transformation, affirmation, and action within a community. And Wexler's research shows how culturally responsive programs that build on existing structures, focus on what versus how solutions can be found, and then create space for collective participation can help provide better outcomes in Indigenous communities. And so basically, like I went in building off of this by sharing examples of case studies, which is a great example of transformational storytelling that tells stories in a way that uses what their current social structure focuses on what is being done, and it also creates space for collective participation. One thing, let me scroll here really quick. the first example that I wanted to share was about Lee's article on Flora Mark's expeditions in urban and rural areas, and how they helped tie both rural and urban Indigenous people back to the land. And the case study was a really good example of anthropological research that incorporated academic data gathering and Alaska Native ways of knowing and being, by highlighting how she shared and procured both traditional food and created this beautiful cycle of connecting rural and Indigenous people to each other. I'm trying to fit in the circle. So there's people who are doing big things in an urban area, but do not have the connection to their traditional land. And so they are connecting to the urban areas by sending different things to them, and also the other way. I was trying to make a circle, but anyways, the sharing that she did was really connecting people with each other, and connecting the people in rural areas to their traditional lands, and then also connecting people in rural areas who are practicing their tradition to more Western foods and culture and things that they may not have access to while living in their community. I also shared about my own experience with growing up on the land, and just how important that was for me, and the learning of the planning and the preparation, the time that went into the process of food preparation and food procurement and preservation, and just the crossover from doing that in an urban area and then going to my hometown and practicing that, and my mom and aunties and Aka teaching me how to pillock a seal and work on sewing projects and preparing traditional foods, and also in the process having time with my Aka, listening to her stories and working on a school project that I was working on at the time about interviewing, and recording this amazing story of her going out on a boat and explaining how the whales came right up next to the boat and what she was feeling in that moment, and basically the lessons that I learned about my own skills, my own strength, and my experiences being really important as I move forward in my life. And also the impact of recording that video and finding it years after that was taken, also after she had passed away, and with those years passing and my gaining more knowledge about the storytelling process and the impacts of Western culture on things like the economy, gender roles, education, and language, I was able to revisit that recording from a new perspective and see how I could continue navigating conversation, practices, and ideas that at the time of revisiting this recording was causing division within my own community. So next I also talked about Turner's article, which is about Point Hope. And so that article really talked about the impacts of the history of land contamination through Project Chariot, and how it impacted the community's relationship to the land, and how a contaminated land cannot sustain a people, and what the community did throughout the process to fight for their future. And so I feel like I really wanted to talk about this because it was a really another great example of research that is highlighting the collision of oral traditions, which the oral traditions kept the knowledge of what animals and the processing of meats and of foods looked like, and the changes that had happened after that project had happened is really what the community members were able to stand on when they were fighting. The thing that really stood out to me the most is this is the community that I am from, and many of the people that were in that article are people that I learned from. And just thinking about their experiences with melding the two worlds together, and how they use their oral history and then also brought it into the political sphere and were able to make changes happen, is really what also helped them, is something that they passed down to me. And they highlighted the importance of authenticity in my own leadership and activism, and the importance of that for the future generations. And they showed me how being there, listening, and standing alongside people can really impact the future of your community. Whew. So, with that being said, there we go. Storytelling is super powerful. It can, I want to say before I go into this fully, this last slide, I have learned from my elders that our people have existed and stewarded the land and coexisted on this land since time immemorial, and the relationships that we have with the world and with each other are really important. And now that we live in a time where we are exposed to and interacting with a new culture, new to us culture, it's 100 plus, not that much over 100 years, but it's really important to use the best of both worlds. And I've seen throughout this research and from my own experience that when we are able to include both the transfer of knowledge as a way of living and the documentation for future learning, it can help us create and sustain changes within our communities. And the two major things that it does is help to dismantle distorted perceptions of both sides of the communities. And it can also provide a platform to amplify Indigenous voices. So with that being said, I think that transformational storytelling helps us move away from data that can be manipulated and into a space where lives can be transformed, and people from all walks of life can see their own stories within the stories of other people, and it preserves knowledge systems, identities, and ways of living. So think about it and how you are providing storytelling. And yeah, that's all that I have. Thank you. Bye.